In the year 376 after the birth of Christ, the Roman Empire stood as the most formidable human construction the world had ever known. From the sun-scorched sands of North Africa to the fog-draped hills of Britannia, from the silted banks of the Euphrates to the cold gray waters of the Danube, Rome's shadow stretched across the known world like a second sky. For 700 years, the eagles of Rome had marched. 7 centuries of conquest, law, road, and blood. The legions, those disciplined, iron-shod columns of organized violence, had broken nations, drowned rebellions, and ground entire civilizations into the dust of history. And yet, on the northern frontier in the autumn of that fateful year, something was gathering. Something that even Rome, in all its ancient arrogance, could not foresee. The Danube, called the Ister by those who first sailed its length, formed the great northern spine of Rome's European frontier. Along its banks, thousands of Roman soldiers stood watch in stone forts and timber towers, their eyes trained on the far shore, where the forests of the Gothic lands began and the familiar world ended. They had stood this watch for generations. They believed they always would. But history does not ask permission. And on the far side of that river, in the vast grasslands and dense forests of what is today Romania and Ukraine, a catastrophe was already in motion. One that had begun not in Rome, not in Gothic tribal halls, but on the wind-lashed steppes of Central Asia, where a people called the Huns were riding west, destroying everything in their path. To understand what happened at the Danube in 376 AD, we must first understand the Goths, not as Rome saw them, as barbarians at the gate, but as they truly were, a sophisticated, complex people with their own laws, their own faith, their own deep sense of honor and belonging. The Goths had lived along Rome's northeastern frontier for over a century. They were not strangers. Roman merchants had traded with them. Roman generals had fought beside them and against them. Some Gothic warriors had even served inside the Roman legions, learning the language, the tactics, the very heartbeat of the empire they would one day help to break. Their society was organized around kin groups and tribal confederacies, led by chieftains of remarkable personal authority. These were not the howling savages of Roman caricature. Gothic leaders negotiated treaties, observed oaths, raised children who could read and write, and worshipped a form of Christianity, Arianism, introduced to them by the missionary bishop Wulfila just decades before. They were, in almost every meaningful sense, neighbors. 2 confederacies dominated the Gothic world in the 4th century. The Thervingi, living closest to the Roman frontier west of the Dniester River, and the Greuthungi, ranging further east across the great open steppe. Both were proud peoples with long memories of Roman treachery and Roman generosity in equal measure. Both were about to have their world shattered, not by Rome, but by something none of them could have imagined. The Huns arrived like a fire that moves faster than men can run. They swept from the east in the early 370s, smashing the Gothic Greuthungi, killing or scattering their warriors, burning their settlements to ash. Then they turned toward the Thervingi. The Gothic chieftain Athanaric attempted to resist. He was broken. His people fled westward in a desperate, terrified tide. Women, children, elders, warriors with nothing but the weapons in their hands and the memory of what had been, pressing toward the one barrier that might stand between them and annihilation. The Danube, and beyond it, Rome. On the Roman side of the Danube, command rested with 2 men whose names history has not treated kindly. Lupicinus, the Comes, a senior military official, and Maximus, his subordinate. These were not heroes from the mold of Julius Caesar or the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. They were administrators in armor, men of the imperial machine who had risen through a bureaucracy as much as through any battlefield. In the autumn of 376, word reached them of the massive Gothic migration pressing toward the river. Hundreds of thousands of people, some historians estimate as many as 200,000 souls, were gathered on the far bank, desperate, frightened, and armed. Their leaders had sent envoys to the Emperor Valens himself, pleading to be allowed to cross, to be settled on Roman land, to become subjects of the empire in exchange for military service and loyalty. Emperor Valens, campaigning in the east against Persia, made his decision from a distance. He would allow the Thervingi to cross. It seemed, on paper, a sound calculation. Rome always needed soldiers. The Goths were formidable fighters. Settled on the depopulated lands of the Balkans, they could be transformed from a threat into a resource. It was the kind of policy Rome had successfully practiced before. But the policy required competent, honest execution. And that was precisely what Lupicinus and Maximus failed to provide. What followed the crossing was not settlement. It was organized extortion. Roman officials charged desperate Gothic families for the right to cross the river. They confiscated Gothic weapons, a humiliation and a vulnerability. They seized Gothic children as hostages under the pretense of good faith. And then, in what may be the single most catastrophic act of official corruption in Roman history, they withheld food. The Goths had crossed in enormous numbers, more than Roman logistics could support even under ideal conditions. But instead of honest effort, the Roman officials sold the starving Goths dog meat in exchange for their remaining possessions. For their children, men who had been freemen on their own land were reduced to selling their sons and daughters into slavery to survive on Roman soil. What Lupicinus and Maximus understood about power, they did not understand about people. And they had fundamentally, catastrophically, misunderstood the Goths. Among the Thervingi who crossed the Danube, one figure stands above the rest in the records that survive. Fritigern. He was a chieftain of considerable skill and, crucially, considerable patience. He had navigated Gothic politics for years, opposing the pagan hardliner Athanaric, embracing Christianity partly as a political gesture of openness toward Rome. He had sought peace. He had sought settlement. He had sought a future for his people within the Roman world rather than against it. That man, the one who wanted accommodation, was being destroyed by what he witnessed on Roman soil. His people were dying. Not from Hun arrows, not from the brutal winter, but from Roman greed. Children, he knew, were being sold. Warriors who had crossed in dignity were crouching in Roman camps, starving, humiliated, watched over by soldiers who treated them as livestock. Fritigern endured. He negotiated. He petitioned. He used every diplomatic tool at his disposal, biding his time with a discipline that speaks to extraordinary strength of character. But inside him, and inside his people, something was curdling. The patience of the dispossessed has a limit. And Lupicinus, with the tin ear of the truly corrupt, was about to push past it. The Roman commander, uneasy about the Gothic numbers and perhaps sensing the resentment building in the encampments, devised a plan that displayed the spectacular combination of cruelty and incompetence that marks the truly dangerous official. He invited the Gothic leaders, Fritigern and several others, to a banquet. It was, of course, a trap. The plan was to seize or kill the Gothic chieftains in one stroke, eliminating the leadership and leaving the Gothic mass leaderless and controllable. But Fritigern suspected the trap. or perhaps he simply felt it. The way men who have survived on the knife's edge of danger develop a sense for the moment before violence. During the banquet, when Roman soldiers moved to seize the guests, Fritigern drew his sword and fought his way out. He escaped. And as he rode back to his people through the dark, everything changed. The Gothic rebellion of 376 did not begin with a grand declaration, a raised standard, a single decisive moment. It began the way true revolutions always begin. Not from ideology, but from the accumulated weight of intolerable suffering finally translated into action. It began in the camps, in the foraging parties that fanned out across Thrace, pillaging for the food Rome had denied them, in the warriors who remembered how to fight and realized they had nothing left to lose. Fritigern was not a man who had wanted this war, but he was a man who, once committed, would pursue it with everything he had. He sent riders to the Refugee, the other Gothic confederation, the ones Rome had refused permission to cross, and they came across the river anyway. He reached out to Hunnic and Alan warriors operating in the region, offering plunder in exchange for their devastating cavalry. The coalition that assembled under his banner was not an army of barbarians. It was an army of the betrayed. For nearly 2 years, the Goths and their allies rampaged through the Balkans. Roman armies moved against them and were beaten back, ambushed, worn down by a foe that understood the terrain, moved with extraordinary mobility, and fought with the ferocity of people who had nowhere to retreat to. Every battle Rome failed to win was a victory for the Goths. Every Roman column that marched out confidently and returned shattered was a recruiting poster for Fritigern's cause. And still Emperor Valens delayed. He was in Antioch, managing the Persian frontier, and the reports from the Balkans were disturbing. But Rome had dealt with barbarian uprisings before. The pattern was familiar: crisis, response, suppression. It would be handled. The legions would march. The Goths would be crushed or dispersed, as such peoples always had been. The arrogance was institutional. It was baked into 7 centuries of Roman success, and it had become, at last, fatal. By the summer of 378 AD, the situation in the Balkans had reached a crisis that even Valens could not ignore from Antioch. He transferred east, established his headquarters at Constantinople, and began assembling the full imperial field army for a decisive confrontation. His nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, was also marching east with reinforcements, having just concluded a successful campaign against the Alemanni on the Rhine. Valens had options. The cautious option, wait for Gratian, combine the eastern and western field armies, and bring overwhelming force to bear, was urged by experienced commanders in his circle. It was the sound military choice. But Valens was not in a sound military mood. He was in the mood of a man who has been embarrassed, whose empire has been bleeding for 2 years from a wound inflicted by people Rome considered beneath contempt. There were also political calculations at work. Gratian's recent victory against the Alemanni had covered the young Western emperor in glory. If Valens now shared the victory over the Goths, the credit would be divided, the triumph diminished. If he struck alone, the victory would be his, and his alone. These are the calculations of a proud man who has mistaken his throne for his ability. History is littered with such men. Valens received intelligence, inaccurate, as it turned out, that the Gothic force he was about to engage numbered only 10,000 warriors. His own army was larger. Victory seemed not merely possible, but certain. He gave the order to advance without waiting for Gratian, and the Eastern Roman field army marched out of Adrianople on the morning of August 9th, 378 AD, toward what would become one of the most consequential battles in human history. The Gothic encampment was located several miles north of Adrianople, today the Turkish city of Edirne, on a low ridge. The Gothic wagon circle, the lager, formed both their camp and their defensive perimeter. Inside it were the women, children, and elders of the Gothic migration. The warriors formed up in front of it. The Roman army marched toward them in the blazing summer heat of a Thracian August. The men had marched for hours, and they had not eaten properly. The sun hammered down on iron helmets and bronze shields. The wheat fields around them had been set ablaze by Gothic scouts, a deliberate tactic, and the smoke rolled across the battlefield in choking waves, adding to the soldiers' disorientation and thirst. Negotiations began. Fritigern sent envoys, requesting a meeting with the emperor himself. Was this genuine, or was it a tactic to buy time? Historians have debated it for 16 centuries. What seems clear is that Fritigern was waiting for something. The Gothic cavalry, under the commanders Alathius and Saphrax, had ridden out that morning on a foraging expedition and had not yet returned. Then, either by accident or design, the battle began before the diplomacy concluded. Roman skirmishers on the flanks opened fire on Gothic positions without orders. The Gothic infantry responded. The full Roman line surged forward in the heat and smoke and chaos, and at precisely that moment, from the hills to the northeast, the Gothic cavalry returned. What happened next was a catastrophe so total, so shocking in its completeness, that Roman writers struggled to find adequate language for it. The Gothic horsemen, a massive, fresh, thundering mass of cavalry, slammed into the Roman right flank with a force that shattered it instantly. The impact rippled across the entire Roman formation, collapsing the line inward. Roman soldiers, packed so tightly they could not raise their weapon arms, were crushed together, unable to fight, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but die. The Roman left wing attempted to disengage and regroup. They were ridden down. The center pushed forward into the Gothic infantry and found itself surrounded. Unit cohesion, the foundation of everything Rome's military system depended upon, disintegrated. Men broke from their formations and ran. The Goths ran them down. Emperor Valens died on that field. Exactly how, we do not know with certainty. The chaos of the battle consumed even the historical record. Some sources say he was struck by an arrow early in the fighting. Others say he was wounded and retreated to a farmhouse, which the Goths then surrounded and burned to the ground, unwilling or unable to enter it against the soldiers still defending the wounded emperor inside. However he died without his purple robe, unrecognized in the carnage. His body never recovered for a proper imperial burial. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men, died at Adrianople on that August afternoon. Dozens of senior officers, commanders, tribunes, the entire military leadership of the Eastern Empire were killed. It was, by any measure, one of the worst military defeats in Roman history. And unlike Cannae, which Hannibal had inflicted on Rome 6 centuries before, Rome would not simply absorb this blow and return stronger. The world had changed too much. The empire had changed too much. The wound at Adrianople would never fully close. In the days that followed, Gothic warriors ranged freely across Thrace. They besieged Adrianople and could not take it, for all the discipline of siege warfare was beyond them. They moved toward Constantinople and turned back, the great walls of the eastern capital still beyond their capacity to breach. They devastated the countryside, but could not consolidate their victory into territorial control. Fritigern is reported to have said that he kept peace with walls, meaning he knew where the Goths' advantage ended. The new emperor of the East, Theodosius, who came to power in January 379, spent years rebuilding the shattered Eastern army and fighting the Goths to a grinding stalemate. He was a capable administrator and a patient strategist, but he did not have the strength to expel the Goths or destroy them. In 382 AD, he concluded a treaty with them that was unlike any Rome had ever signed with a defeated enemy, or, more precisely, with an enemy that had not been defeated. The Goths were settled in the Balkans not as subjects of Rome, but as autonomous federati, allied peoples who maintained their own laws, their own leaders, their own identity, who would fight for Rome when called upon, but would not be absorbed into the Roman system. They were, in effect, a nation within the empire. Rome had bent. For the first time in its history, it had been unable to break those who defied it. Military historians have spent centuries analyzing what Adrianople meant for the art of war. The most common conclusion: it proved the supremacy of heavy cavalry over infantry, that the era of the legion had ended and the era of the mounted warrior had begun. This is probably too neat a summary, but it captures something real. The heavily armored cavalry that shattered Rome at Adrianople foreshadows the knights of medieval Europe, the mounted warriors who would dominate battlefields for 1,000 years to come. What is beyond debate is the political consequence. After Adrianople, Rome could never again assume that its frontiers were secure, that its military dominance was absolute, that the peoples outside the empire could always be controlled. The barbarian kingdoms that would eventually replace Rome in the west, Visigothic Spain, Ostrogothic Italy, Frankish Gaul, all trace their origins, in some sense, to the moment when a Roman emperor decided he did not need to wait for reinforcements. What killed the Roman army at Adrianople was not Gothic courage, though the Goths were brave. It was not superior Gothic tactics, though Fritigern was a gifted commander. What killed Rome's eastern army on that August afternoon was a chain of human failures that stretched back 2 full years and implicated every level of the imperial system. It began with corruption, the petty, grinding, institutionalized corruption of Lupicinus and Maximus, who turned a policy of integration into a policy of exploitation and created enemies from people who had come to Rome seeking safety. It continued with arrogance, the casual Roman assumption that the Goths, like all barbarians, could be cheated, humiliated, and managed without consequence. It culminated in pride, the imperial pride of Valens, who could not accept the necessity of waiting for his nephew's army, because victory shared was victory diminished. Fritigern had not wanted this war. He had crossed the Danube seeking a home, not a battlefield. Rome gave him no other choice. And when it came to war, he fought it with everything he had, and won a victory that shook the foundations of the ancient world. He disappears from the historical record after the peace of 382 AD. We do not know how or when he died. He had outlived his purpose in history's accounting. But the world he helped create, a world where Rome shared its borders with peoples it could not destroy or fully absorb, endured long after his name was forgotten. The Danube still flows, cold and gray and indifferent, as it has flowed for 10,000 years. On its northern bank, in what is now Romania, archaeological teams have found the traces of Gothic settlements from this period, artifacts of a people on the move, a people between worlds. And on the southern bank, in modern Bulgaria and northern Greece, the traces of the catastrophe are there too, in burned villa sites, in hordes of coins buried and never recovered, in the sudden end of administrative records that had been kept for generations. The silence in those records is its own kind of testimony. Something ended at Adrianople. Not Rome. Rome would endure for another century in the west, and more than 1,000 years in the east as the Byzantine Empire. But the certainty ended. The assumption that Rome was permanent, invulnerable, destined. That ended on a hot August afternoon in 378 AD, when the eagles fell, and an emperor burned in a farmhouse, and a people who had only wanted a home found, instead, that they had changed the world. History is rarely made by the events we plan. It is made in the gaps between plans, in the moment a chieftain escapes a banquet, in the moment a cavalry force returns from foraging at exactly the wrong time, in the moment a proud emperor decides he does not need to wait. The Gothic tide that broke against Rome in 376 and swept over it at Adrianople in 378 was not inevitable. It was made step by step, decision by decision, by men who could have chosen otherwise and did not. Lupicinus could have fed the Goths. Valens could have waited for Gratian. 100 small choices could have been different. But they were not. And so the eagles fell. And so the world changed. And so, 16 centuries later, we are still living in the world that was born when the great tide of the Goths crossed the Danube River, seeking nothing more than safety, and found instead that they had shattered an empire. The Danube flows on. The eagles do not return.